At 4:30 in the morning, while the rest of Red Hollow, Kansas was still asleep, 72-year-old Ava Williams was dragging hay bales through knee-deep snow with a rusted tractor that sounded like it should have died sometime during the Reagan administration. And the strange part: the sky was clear. No storm warnings, no falling snow, no wind strong enough to justify what she was doing. By sunrise, half the county had already heard about it. Men standing outside Harper Feed and Supply laughed openly as Ava loaded extra diesel cans, cattle medicine chains, and salt blocks into the back of her truck. Old age finally caught up with her, Travis Mercer said loud enough for everyone to hear. The crowd laughed with him, but Ava never answered. She just kept looking north. Now let me pause here for a moment, because people who survive long enough on the prairie learn something most folks never do. Sometimes the land whispers long before it screams. That evening, Ava chained shut the last steel gate on the north pasture. And for the first time in 30 years, she looked afraid. If something about this story feels familiar, stay with me. Red Hollow. Kansas sat in the kind of country where people trusted pickup trucks more than strangers and judged a person by three things: how straight their fences stood, how healthy their cattle looked in February, and whether they complained when winter got cruel. It was cattle country, hard country, the kind of place where wind never really stopped moving, and old men still measured storms by the ache in their knees instead of weather apps. And for nearly 40 years, nobody in Red Hollow questioned the judgment of Daniel Williams. Now, let me tell you about Daniel for a moment. Daniel Williams had been one of those prairie men who understood weather the same way sailors understood tides. He could step outside at dawn, smell the air once, and tell you whether snow would drift east or north by midnight. People trusted him because he'd earned it. Not with speeches, not with money, certainly not with ego, but because during the whiteout of 1989, the storm older ranchers still spoke about in lowered voices Daniel Williams had somehow brought nearly his entire herd home alive, while other ranches lost hundreds of cattle buried under snowdrifts. Men remembered things like that. The problem was, Daniel had been dead for 8 years, and in the minds of most people in Red Hollow, whatever wisdom had once existed on the Williams Ranch had died in the ground beside him. Ava Williams woke every morning at 4:30 without an alarm. Habit. At 72 years old, her body carried the schedule even when sleep did not. She pulled on wool socks, thermal coveralls, and the same faded brown coat she'd worn for nearly 15 winters. Then she stepped onto the porch with a flashlight and stood perfectly still beneath the dark Kansas sky, listening, not praying. Listening. If you're still with me, understand this. People who live long enough on the prairie stop treating land like property. After enough storms, enough droughts, enough funerals, the land starts feeling more like a living thing with moods of its own. Ava listened to fence wires hum in the wind. She listened to cattle shifting in distant pasture shadows. She listened to the silence between gusts. Then she wrote everything down, every morning. Inside a black notebook kept beside the kitchen stove: temperature, wind direction, air pressure, bird movement, frost thickness, cattle behavior. 30 years of notes stacked in careful rows across the shelves near her dining room. Most people in town thought the notebooks were proof she'd become lonely after Daniel died. They were wrong. The Williams Ranch covered a little over 300 acres north of Red Hollow. Not enormous by Kansas standards, but respectable. Enough pasture land to support a modest herd if managed carefully. And Ava managed it alone. That fact alone bothered people. Not openly, at least not always, but quietly. Because Red Hollow was the kind of town where widows were expected to slow down gracefully, sell the ranch, move closer to town, let younger men take over. Instead, Ava kept repairing fences herself, kept hauling feed herself, kept checking calves herself, and every year she stayed on that ranch alone seemed to irritate certain people more and more, especially Travis Mercer. Travis was 38 years old and looked exactly like the kind of rancher local banks loved loaning money to. Tall, confident, expensive boots, clean trucks, new equipment. He ran Mercer Cattle Company like a businessman instead of a rancher, which younger men in the county admired. Drones for herd tracking, GPS fencing systems, automated feed monitoring, and above all else, expansion. Travis believed bigger always meant smarter. Over the past 6 years, he'd bought neighboring grazing leases, aggressively growing his herd faster than anyone else in the county. People called him the future of Kansas ranching. Travis liked hearing that. What Travis did not like was the Williams Ranch sitting directly between two parcels he wanted badly. More than once he'd offered to buy Ava out, and more than once she refused him without negotiation. "No offense, Ava," he told her once outside the livestock auction barn, "but you can't run that place forever." Ava had looked at him calmly before answering. "Neither can you." That answer bothered him more than it should have. Now let me pause here, because men like Travis Mercer are rarely cruel in the beginning. Arrogant, yes. Dismissive, certainly. But the dangerous thing about arrogance is that it slowly teaches a person to mistake confidence for wisdom. And Kansas winters are very unforgiving teachers. That Tuesday morning after the feed store incident, Ava drove fence lines along the north pasture alone. The snow beneath her boots made sharp cracking sounds as she walked. Something felt wrong. Not dramatic, not obvious. Wrong in the quiet way animals sense earthquakes before humans do. She noticed the cattle standing closer together than usual, their backs angled strangely toward the north wind. Several calves refused to leave sheltered ground. Then she noticed the birds, too low. Blackbirds skimmed the fields in nervous patterns barely above the grass. Ava stopped walking. Her eyes narrowed. Daniel used to say birds told the truth long before weather stations did. Back inside the farmhouse, Ava pulled an old notebook from the shelf labeled Winter 1989. The pages smelled faintly of dust and smoke. She turned carefully through Daniel's handwriting until she found the entry she remembered. Rapid pressure drop, birds flying low, warmth before freeze, north wind unstable. Ava stared at the words for a long time. Outside sunlight stretched peacefully across the snow-covered prairie. Beautiful. Still. Deceptively calm. Then the kitchen phone rang. It was Ellie Harper from the feed store. "You all right out there?" Ellie asked gently. Ava glanced toward the window. "I'm fine. You know folks are talking." "I know." Ellie hesitated. "Travis says you're scaring people." That almost made Ava smile. "Storms scare people," she said quietly. "Not me." After the call ended, Ava walked back outside, carrying a steel hammer and a bucket of fence staples. The north wind touched her face again. Warmer now. Too warm. And that frightened her more than cold ever could. By late afternoon, Travis Mercer was posting videos online from his ranch. Blue skies overhead. Cattle feeding calmly. "Guess the apocalypse got delayed," he joked to the camera. Hundreds of people watched. Meanwhile, Ava Williams spent the final hour before sunset reinforcing an old gate most ranchers had forgotten even existed. Her hands shook slightly from arthritis as she tightened the chain links. Not from weakness, from urgency. Because deep down beneath all the years and all the silence, Ava Williams had begun to feel something she had not felt since the winter Daniel nearly died in a whiteout storm 30 years earlier. Fear. Real fear. That night before going inside, she looked north again, and far out across the prairie horizon, the clouds had started stacking like dark walls. By Wednesday morning, Ava Williams had stopped acting like a woman preparing for weather. She had started acting like a woman preparing for war, not the kind fought with guns, the older kind, the kind fought with rope-feed fence posts, frozen fingers, and decisions made before anyone else understands there is danger coming. At first light, she drove the old tractor out toward the northwest boundary, where the pasture rolled down into a shallow ravine lined with cottonwoods. Most ranchers in Red Hollow considered that low ground useless in winter. Too hard to reach, too uneven, too many old fallen limbs. Daniel had never called it useless. He had called it shelter. Ava climbed down from the tractor, slowly bracing one hand on the wheel well until her knees agreed to carry her weight. Then she took a crowbar from the toolbox and began prying frozen brush away from an old gate half buried in snow. The gate had not been used in years, not because it was broken, because nobody remembered why it mattered. Now let me pause here. That is how real wisdom disappears. Not all at once, not in some dramatic collapse. It disappears when one generation stops asking why an old gate was built in a strange place, when a notebook gets mistaken for clutter, when a widow's habits get mistaken for loneliness. Ava knew exactly why that gate was there. If the north wind came hard enough, the open flats would become a death trap. Snow would sweep across those acres with nothing to slow it down, piling in waves against cattle bodies until the animals drifted with the storm instead of against it. But the ravine was different. Cottonwoods broke the wind. The slope cut the gusts. The old creek bed held less drifting snow, and if cattle were guided in before panic started, they would stay. If. That little word mattered, because cattle could be moved before fear. But after fear took them, good luck. By 8 o'clock, Ava had cleared enough brush to swing the gate open. Its hinges screamed like something wounded. She stood there a moment, breathing hard, her breath white in front of her face. Then she smiled faintly. "Still works," she whispered. Across town, Miller's Diner was filling with breakfast gossip. Miller's was the kind of place where coffee came before menus, and everyone knew which booth belonged to whom. Ranchers sat near the window. Retired men sat closest to the pie case. The women who truly knew everything sat in the middle pretending not to listen. By 9, Ava Williams was the topic. Roy said he saw her hauling hay clear out by the ravine, one man said. Ravine another laughed. "What's she feeding down there, ghosts?" A few chuckles rolled through the room. Travis Mercer sat at the end of the counter, stirring sugar into coffee he barely drank. "I told you," he said, loud enough to be heard. "She's living 30 years behind the rest of us. Next thing you know, she'll be tying ribbons on fence posts to scare off evil spirits." That got a bigger laugh. But Ellie Harper, who had stopped in to pick up breakfast biscuits, did not laugh. She had seen Ava's eyes the day before. Not confused eyes, not foolish eyes, focused eyes. The kind of eyes people get when they know something and hate that nobody else will listen. Sheriff Roy Bennett sat alone near the back, pretending to read the local paper. Roy was 64 wide through the shoulders and slow to speak, unless speech was necessary. He had known Ava since she was still Ava Carter before Daniel Williams ever asked her to dance at the county fair. Roy folded the paper once and said, "Ava Williams has forgotten more about winter cattle than most of you have learned." The room quieted just a little. Travis smiled without warmth. "No disrespect, Sheriff, but knowing winter in 1989 doesn't mean you understand ranching now." Roy looked at him over the top of his glasses. "Snow still falls the same way, Travis." Nobody laughed at that. Not because it was funny, because it was true. Back on the ranch, Ava worked until her gloves stiffened with ice. She broke frozen crust around 3 water troughs, then checked the heating coils on 2 of them, and cursed softly when one failed to respond. She drove back to the barn, found an old replacement element in a coffee can full of parts, and replaced it herself with a screwdriver Daniel had wrapped in red tape so it would not vanish among the tools. Her hands were not young anymore. The joints had thickened. The fingers sometimes locked. Cold made every movement cost more than it used to, but Ava had learned a long time ago that pain was not always a stop sign. Sometimes it was just the toll booth. By noon she was moving hay, not stacking it near the main barn where it looked sensible. She was placing it in strange locations behind cedar breaks along the ravine approach near a low wind-sheltered hollow west of the creek bed. Anyone watching from the road would have thought she was scattering feed randomly. But Ava was not feeding cattle for today. She was drawing a map for tomorrow. Every hay bale was a breadcrumb. Every salt block was an invitation. Every cleared path was a decision made before darkness could steal the choice. Sit with that for a moment. Most people wait until disaster arrives before they decide who they are. Ava had survived enough seasons to know that character shows up earlier than that. Character is how you prepare when the sky still looks calm. Late that afternoon, Ava entered the Old West storage shed. The door stuck swollen from years of damp winters. She pushed her shoulder into it twice before it opened with a groan. Inside, dust hung in the air like old memory. There were things in that shed most people would have thrown away. A box of brass cattle bells, kerosene lanterns wrapped in newspaper, bundles of orange fence flags, hand-drawn pasture maps sealed in plastic sleeves, a rusted coffee can full of gate keys. Ava stood in the doorway for a long time. Because this shed had been Daniel's place, not the main barn where visitors came, not the machine shed where neighbors borrowed tools and pretended not to notice Ava doing half the repairs. This little shed had been where Daniel kept the things he believed might save lives someday. After the blizzard of 1989, he had come home changed. He still laughed, still worked, still kissed Ava's forehead when he came in cold from chores. But something in him had gone quiet. For months afterward, he woke before dawn and walked the property alone, marking windbreaks, measuring drifts, testing cattle paths. People thought he was grieving the animals he'd lost. Ava knew better. He was listening to the land apologize. Or maybe he was apologizing to it. She picked up one of the cattle bells and turned it in her hand. The metal was cold and dull, but when she shook it once, the sound rang clear. Daniel had trained the herd to follow that sound years ago. Not all cattle would, not every time, but enough of them remembered, enough that the rest would follow. Ava filled a canvas sack with bells. Outside, the day was warmer than it had any right to be. Snow softened along the fence posts. Water dripped from the barn roof in quick, nervous rhythms. A false thaw, Daniel would have called it. Warmth before a hard fall. That evening, the official forecast still said light winter flurries by the end of the week. Maybe 3 inches. Moderate wind. Nothing urgent. Nothing worth embarrassing yourself over. Ava read the forecast twice, then turned it off. She trusted instruments. She just did not worship them. Before bed, she made one last round. The cattle stood quietly in the distance, their dark shapes gathered closer than usual beneath the fading sky. One old lead cow lifted her head when Ava approached, ears forward, watching. Ava tied the first bell around that cow's neck. The sound was soft, lonely, familiar. For a moment, Ava could almost hear Daniel behind her. Storms don't kill cattle first, Ava. Pride does. She closed her eyes. When she opened them again, the wind had shifted. Not much, just enough. From west to north. And somewhere beyond the dark pasture far across the flat winterland, something moved through the night with no sound at all. Ava stood still until her breath caught. Then she turned toward the barn and whispered, "There you are." Thursday morning arrived, bright and strangely beautiful. The kind of winter morning people trusted too easily. Sunlight spilled across the prairie in pale gold ribbons. Frost sparkled along fence wire. The snow looked soft instead of dangerous. Even the wind had settled into something gentle enough to fool a man into believing nature had softened overnight. But Ava Williams did not trust beautiful mornings in January, especially warm ones. By 7 o'clock, she was already outside, reinforcing the southern windbreak corridor with fresh chain ties. Her breath moved slowly through the cold, while the old tractor idled nearby, coughing smoke into the still air. She paused twice to flex her aching fingers. Arthritis had settled deep into her hands years ago, but she treated pain the same way prairie people treated weather. You respected it. You adjusted for it. But you did not surrender your life to it. Across the county, Travis Mercer was having a very different morning, because while Ava Williams prepared for survival, Travis prepared for attention. Now let me tell you something about modern pride in small towns. It rarely arrives looking evil. Usually it arrives polished. Clean trucks, new jackets with embroidered logos, drone footage on social media, interviews with local farm magazines talking about innovation and the future of ranching, and Travis Mercer loved every bit of it. By 38, he had built Mercer Cattle Company into the fastest-growing operation in the county. Bankers liked him because he spoke in numbers. Younger ranchers admired him because he looked successful. Even people who disliked him admitted he worked hard. But Travis had one weakness men often mistake for strength. He believed technology could replace humility. That morning, he stood beside a brand new feed mixer while recording another video for his online followers. "Blue skies over Red Hollow," he said into the camera with a grin. "Looks like the apocalypse got postponed again." A few ranch hands laughed behind him. Then Travis added, "Some folks are still preparing for a storm that isn't coming. Guess that's what happens when you spend too much time listening to ghost stories." Everybody watching knew exactly who he meant. By noon, the video had spread all over town. At Harper Feed and Supply, customers replayed it while standing beside shelves of cattle mineral and fencing wire. Even Ellie Harper looked uncomfortable. She shouldn't have to hear that. She muttered quietly. One rancher shrugged. "Well, if she's wrong, she's making herself look foolish." Ellie glanced toward the north windows where clouds were beginning to flatten strangely along the horizon. "And if she's right?" Nobody answered. Meanwhile, Ava continued working, not frantically, not emotionally. That was the strange thing about her. The more nervous she became, the calmer she appeared. She spent the afternoon checking hidden fence markers Daniel had installed decades earlier. Most were nearly invisible, now rusted iron stakes placed low along certain ridges and creek bends. To outsiders, they looked meaningless. To Ava, they were winter lifelines. When whiteout conditions erased the horizon, those markers became roads, and roads became survival. If you're still with me, understand this. The prairie is one of the few places left in America where confidence can still get a person killed. Not immediately, not dramatically, but slowly, quietly, one wrong assumption at a time. Around 3 that afternoon, Ava drove into town for more diesel fuel. The moment she stepped into Harper Feed and Supply, the room changed. Conversation softened. Not silent exactly, just uncomfortable. Ava removed her gloves carefully, while snow melted from her boots onto the wooden floorboards. Travis Mercer stood near the front counter talking with 2 younger ranchers. He noticed her immediately. "Well," he said loudly, smiling for the audience around him, "if it isn't Red Hollow's official storm prophet." A few people chuckled nervously. Ava ignored him and addressed Ellie instead. "I need 4 more cans of diesel." Ellie nodded immediately. Got him in back. But Travis was not finished. "You know, the Weather Service updated again this morning," he said. 3 inches, maybe 4. Ava said nothing. "Or maybe your tractor knows something satellites don't." More laughter. Now let me pause here, because humiliation in small towns has a particular flavor to it. It isn't screaming. It isn't cruelty in the obvious sense. It's the slow pressure of being turned into entertainment. And older people feel that pressure more deeply than most. Not because they're weaker, because they remember when dignity still mattered. Ava finally turned toward Travis. "You ever lose cattle in a blizzard?" she asked quietly. The room shifted slightly. Travis crossed his arms. "Not yet." Ava nodded once. That word matters. Then she picked up her gloves and walked toward the door. One of the younger ranchers smirked and whispered something under his breath. "Old woman's gone crazy." Ava heard it. Of course she did, but she kept walking. Outside, the air felt wrong again, warmer still. Snow along the roadside had begun collapsing into gray slush, even though January should have been locked solid this time of year. Ava loaded the diesel cans slowly into the truck bed. Then she stopped. Her eyes narrowed toward the cattle fields west of town. Every herd she could see was facing south. Not grazing, waiting. Back at the ranch. Ava moved quickly for the first time all week. She opened 2 additional ravine gates, spread hay along the sheltered corridor, checked the cattle bells again, filled lanterns with kerosene. Then she walked into the machine shed where Daniel's old tractor sat cooling beneath weak yellow light. The tractor was nearly 50 years old. Paint faded, seat cracked, engine loud enough to wake counties. Travis Mercer once called it museum equipment, but Daniel trusted that tractor more than most people. Because old machinery had one advantage modern equipment sometimes lacked: it could still work without computers. Ava rested one hand on the steering wheel. For a moment, exhaustion washed over her. Not physical exhaustion. Loneliness. That deep prairie loneliness that arrives after sunset when the chores are done and nobody waits inside the house anymore. She remembered winters beside Daniel, coffee warming on the dashboard during late-night calving checks, their arguments about weather forecasts, the way he used to stop mid-conversation whenever the wind changed direction. He would tilt his head slightly and say, "Hear that?" And somehow, he always did hear it first. Ava sat quietly inside the tractor cab until darkness settled outside. Then she whispered something she had not said aloud in years. "I'm trying." The barn answered only with the soft ticking of cooling metal. Later that evening, Travis Mercer hosted drinks at Riley's bar just outside town. Music played, ranch hands laughed. Snow boots stomped melted slush across the floorboards. And naturally, Ava Williams became part of the entertainment, again. Travis raised a beer and announced, "To surviving the great Kansas blizzard of absolutely nothing." The room erupted. One ranch hand asked if they should start building arks next. Another joked that Ava probably had cattle wearing winter coats by now. The laughter rolled warm and easy through the building, because people enjoy mocking fear, right up until the moment fear arrives. Sheriff Roy Bennett sat near the end of the counter nursing black coffee instead of beer. He watched the room carefully, watched Travis, watched the younger men laughing too hard. Then Roy looked outside through the frosted bar window. The temperature had started falling fast, very fast, and somewhere far north beyond the dark prairie, lightning flickered silently inside clouds no forecast had predicted. Roy muttered softly to himself, "Lord help us." Back on the ranch, Ava Williams stepped outside one final time before bed. The wind had died completely now. No movement, no sound. Even the cattle stood unnaturally still beneath the moonlight. That frightened her most of all, because the prairie was never truly silent unless something terrible was coming. Then one old cow lifted its head sharply toward the north. The bell around its neck rang once. Ava felt cold move through her chest, not outside cold, the deeper kind, instinct. And at that exact moment she realized something that made her blood run thin. The storm was moving faster than Daniel's notes predicted, much faster. Ava Williams did not sleep that night. Not really. She sat at the kitchen table beneath the yellow light above the stove, while cold coffee turned bitter beside her untouched hands. Outside the farmhouse windows, darkness stretched across the prairie like an ocean waiting to rise. And spread open across the table in front of her were Daniel's notebooks. Dozens of them. Black covers, worn corners. Years of weather pressed into paper. Most people in Red Hollow thought Daniel Williams had simply been an old rancher with good instincts. That was not entirely true. Daniel had become obsessed after the blizzard of 1989. Obsessed men are dangerous in different ways. Some destroy themselves. Others spend the rest of their lives trying to make sure disaster never surprises them again. Daniel became the second kind. Now let me tell you what happened during that storm, because everything Ava was doing now began there, January 1989. The worst whiteout western Kansas had seen in decades. Back then, Daniel Williams had still believed strength alone could save cattle. Most ranchers did. They trusted open grazing patterns, standard feed placements, and experience passed down without question. Then the storm arrived faster than forecasted. Much faster. By the second night, snowdrifts had swallowed entire fence lines. Wind gusts pushed cattle into panic movement across exposed flats where they slowly froze, standing together shoulder to shoulder. Daniel lost nearly half his herd in 36 hours. Half. Sit with that for a moment. Most people think ranching breaks a man slowly through hard work. That's not true. Sometimes it breaks him all at once. Daniel spent days afterward helping neighbors drag frozen cattle bodies from snowbanks. Some animals had suffocated in drift piles. Others froze where they stood, packed tightly together, trying to block the wind from each other. For months after that storm, Daniel barely spoke during supper, not because he was weak, because guilt is loud even when a house is quiet. One night that spring, Ava found him outside alone, studying wind movement across pasture grass long after sunset. "What are you looking for?" she asked. Daniel answered without turning around. "The mistake." That sentence changed the rest of his life. And eventually Ava's, too. After 1989, Daniel stopped ranching like everybody else. While neighboring operations focused on herd expansion and equipment upgrades, Daniel studied survival patterns. He researched prairie storms from Nebraska to Montana. He spoke with old cattlemen nobody listened to anymore. He drove hundreds of miles to inspect ranches built before modern fencing changed cattle movement. People in town joked that Daniel Williams was becoming superstitious. They laughed when he planted rows of cedar windbreaks in strange locations, laughed when he dug protected feed stations into ravines, laughed when he started hanging brass bells around led cows during winter movement training. One rancher even asked him if he planned on teaching the cattle church hymns next. Daniel never argued back. He simply kept building, because some people would rather look foolish for years than helpless for one night. Ava turned another notebook page carefully. Inside were hand-drawn diagrams of snowdrift behavior across the north pasture, wind arrows, elevation marks, shelter corridors. Daniel had mapped the ranch the way generals map battlefields, not for ordinary days, for the worst day. If you're still with me, remember this: preparation always looks excessive until the moment it becomes necessary. Outside, wind brushed lightly against the farmhouse siding. Too soft. Still wrong. Ava checked the clock. 2:13 a.m. Then she stood abruptly. Decision made. No more waiting. She pulled on boots, gloves, and heavy coveralls before heading back into the darkness. The temperature had climbed nearly 15 degrees since sunset. That terrified her, because prairie storms often arrived hidden behind false warmth. Warm air rushed north ahead of the freeze line, like a thief opening the door before violence entered the room. Ava climbed into the old tractor and turned the ignition. The engine fought twice before roaring awake. Good. She needed it alive tonight. By 3 a.m, floodlights moved slowly across the Williams Ranch as Ava began shifting the herd toward the sheltered ravine corridors. Not aggressively. That was critical. Panicked cattle became dangerous cattle. Instead, she worked patiently. Hay placement, bell sounds, gentle pressure from horseback paths Daniel had trained into the herd years earlier. The brass bell around the lead cow rang softly through the darkness. Clang, pause, clang, and slowly, almost reluctantly, the herd began moving, not because cattle understood storms, because they understood routine. Because Daniel Williams had spent years teaching them where safety lived. Across town, Travis Mercer slept comfortably. His cattle remained spread across open north pasture, where winter grazing was easiest and most profitable. Plenty of exposure, plenty of open feed access. Efficient. Efficient things often fail beautifully in disasters. Around 4:30, Ava stopped near the old ravine entrance and looked back toward the open prairie. Clouds had thickened now. No stars visible anymore. The air tasted metallic. Then she noticed something that tightened her chest immediately. The cattle were moving faster on their own. That almost never happened. Animals resisted movement at night unless fear was already inside them. Ava removed her gloves briefly and touched the frozen gatepost beside her. The wood felt damp. Another bad sign. Moisture rising before hard freeze. "Come on," she whispered softly to the herd. "Keep moving." Hours passed that way. Slow work. Cold work. The kind of labor old bodies pay for afterward. But by dawn, nearly the entire Williams herd had been guided into the protected ravine system Daniel built decades earlier. Ava finally leaned against the tractor hood, breathing hard. Snow had not started yet. That was the dangerous part. From a distance, everything still looked ordinary. Back in Red Hollow, people woke to calm skies and ordinary routines. Kids boarded school buses, coffee brewed inside diners, Ranchers checked weather apps showing minor snow accumulation, arriving sometime late Friday. Nothing severe, nothing historic. Nothing worth humiliating yourself over. Travis Mercer stepped outside his ranch office around 7:30 and smiled at the clear horizon. He immediately recorded another video. While he laughed into the camera, looks like Ava Williams moved half her cattle into a ditch for nothing. The comment section exploded with jokes. One person asked if the cows were hiding from ghosts. Another wrote, "Maybe the old woman can predict aliens next." Travis loved it. Attention always feels like validation to arrogant men. Meanwhile, Ava stood alone near the ravine edge, watching her herd settle quietly among the cottonwoods below. Protected. For now, she should have felt relief. Instead, dread deepened. Because the prairie had become too quiet. No birds. No distant highway sounds. Even the wind seemed to be holding its breath. Then, Ava noticed something else. Water dripping from fence wire. In January. Her face tightened instantly. Now, let me pause here. Rapid warming before Arctic collapse creates some of the deadliest blizzard conditions on Earth. Moisture first, freeze second, then wind. And when wind arrives across wet ground with plunging temperatures, everything turns lethal at once. Ava climbed down into the ravine carrying another sack of bells. The cattle lifted their heads as she approached. Some recognized her immediately and moved toward the hay placements she had prepared days earlier. Daniel used to say cattle remembered calm more than commands, so Ava stayed calm. Even while fear slowly unfolded inside her like ice water, by noon temperatures had risen into the 40s. Snow melted rapidly across Red Hollow. People laughed even harder now. At Miller's Diner, one rancher joked that Ava Williams probably scared herself into early spring. Travis Mercer bought drinks for half the lunch crowd. "Guess old Prairie Wisdom missed this one," he said proudly. But Sheriff Roy Bennett was no longer smiling, because around lunchtime, the northern horizon darkened in a way he had not seen since childhood. Not storm clouds exactly, something heavier, a moving wall. Roy stepped outside the diner and stared north for a very long time. Then he noticed the wind, or rather, the absence of it. And suddenly he remembered something his father once told him after a terrible winter storm in 1966. The prairie goes quiet right before it tries to kill you, back at the ranch. Ava Williams stood beside Daniel's old weather pole as the first pressure crack split across the sky. Not thunder, something deeper, like the atmosphere itself breaking apart. She closed her eyes briefly, then whispered into the stillness, "You were right, Daniel." And far beyond the north pasture, the storm finally revealed itself. By mid-afternoon, Red Hollow still looked peaceful enough to deceive anyone who wanted to be deceived. That is an important distinction, because nature does not always trick people. Sometimes people beg to be tricked. They look at blue sky and call it proof. They feel warm air in January and call it blessing. They see one old woman preparing for something they cannot yet see, and instead of asking what she knows, they laugh because laughter feels safer than doubt. Ava Williams had no time left for their laughter. At 2:40 p.m., she stood in the north pasture beside Daniel's old weather pole and watched the mercury fall 5 degrees in less than 20 minutes. 5 degrees. Most folks would not notice that. Ava did. The air changed texture around her. The false warmth thinned. The damp snow beneath her boots began crusting at the surface. Somewhere far beyond the northern horizon, the storm was pulling cold down behind itself, like a blade being drawn from a sheath. She turned back toward the ravine. The cattle were mostly settled now, gathered among cottonwoods and cedar brakes feeding from hay, placed exactly where Daniel's maps had said drifting would be lightest. A few younger animals still lingered near the slope, restless, uncertain testing whether they could return to open ground. Ava knew better than to let them. Not now. She walked the corridor with slow determination, tying orange markers to low branches, checking chains on gates, tapping each latch twice the way Daniel used to. Then she hung the final cattle bell on a wide-shouldered red cow, with a white blaze down its face. "That's right," Ruby Ava whispered. "You keep them in." The cow blinked calmly, chewing hay. And for one strange second, Ava almost laughed, because there she was, 72 years old, talking to a cow like it was a deputy sheriff. But then the wind touched the back of her neck, lightly, just once, from the north. Her smile vanished. Now let me pause here. There are moments in life when your body understands something before your mind admits it. A mother hearing a child cough wrong in the night. A soldier noticing silence in the trees. An old ranchwoman feeling one thread of wind and knowing a whole county is out of time. Ava moved faster after that. She drove the tractor up toward the barn and loaded the last emergency supplies, feed sacks, tow chains, 2 lanterns, bolt cutters, a thermos of coffee. She knew she would forget to drink and Daniel's laminated pasture map. Then she carried a small battery radio into the cab and turned it on. The announcer's voice crackled through static. "Winter weather advisory upgraded for portions of northwestern Kansas late tonight." Ava stared at the radio. Late tonight. They were still wrong. She could feel it. The storm would not wait until night. Across town, life continued in that stubborn way towns behave right before history interrupts them. At Riley's bar, Travis Mercer had gathered with 6 ranch hands and a few younger cattlemen who treated him like he had already won the future. He was in a good mood. Of course he was. His videos mocking Ava had been shared all morning. People laughed. Customers liked him. The bank liked him. Even county commissioners spoke of his operation as a model for young agriculture. Travis stood near the pool table, wearing a clean canvas jacket with the Mercer Cattle Company logo stitched on the chest. Some men need trophies. Some wear them, forecast says advisory now. One ranch hand mentioned, glancing at his phone. Travis waved it off. Advisory doesn't mean disaster. Temperature's dropping. It's January, Travis said. That happens. A few men laughed, but not all of them. One younger rancher named Caleb Price looked uneasy. Caleb was 26, newly married, running 80 head on leased land, and still humble enough to know he didn't know everything. He had driven past Ava's ranch that morning. He had seen the cattle already moved, the hay staged. The gates opened, the ravine prepared. Something about it stayed with him. She moved early for a reason, Caleb said quietly. Travis looked at him. The room cooled in a different way. "Caleb," Travis said, smiling, "you want to run your operation based on superstition, go right ahead." It didn't look like superstition. No. Travis replied. It looked like fear. Now listen carefully. That sentence mattered, because Travis had mistaken fear for weakness. But fear, properly understood, is one of the oldest forms of intelligence. Ava was afraid because she was paying attention. Travis was calm because he was not. Back at the Williams Ranch, Ava took one final walk through the farmhouse before committing herself to the night's work. She checked the wood stove, filled a water jug, left extra blankets near the back door in case anyone needed shelter later. Then she stopped beside the dining table, where Daniel's notebook still lay open under the lamp. His handwriting filled the page. "If pressure falls faster than expected, move before visibility changes. Waiting for snow is waiting too long." Ava rested her palm over those words. The house around her felt painfully quiet. There are certain kinds of silence only widows know. Not empty silence. Worse. Almost full silence. The kind where every room still remembers the person who is gone. Daniel's coat hook by the back door remained empty. His coffee mug chipped along the rim still sat on the shelf above the stove. His old cap hung in the mudroom dust gathered along the brim. 8 years should have made those things easier. It had not. Ava whispered, "I hope I heard you right." Then she turned off the kitchen light and walked back into the cold. At 4:18 p.m., the first hard gust struck. It came so suddenly that the barn doors slammed against their chains. Ava turned toward the north. The horizon had disappeared, not faded. Disappeared. A wall of white advanced across the prairie, swallowing fence lines, pasture posts, and distant cottonwoods in a single, moving mass. The radio inside the tractor crackled again. Conditions may deteriorate rapidly. Ava climbed into the cab. They already have, she said. The tractor groaned forward, headlights cutting weakly through the dimming afternoon. Her first priority was the west gate. If that gate froze open, the young cattle might drift toward exposed pasture once panic started. Daniel's map marked it in red for a reason. She reached it just as sleet began hitting the windshield sideways. Not snow yet. Ice. Tiny hard pellets tapping against glass like fingernails. By 4:40, the temperature had dropped another 9 degrees. By 5:00, visibility had collapsed to less than 100 yards. By 5:15, Red Hollow finally understood that the old woman had not been imagining anything. Phones began ringing, first between neighbors, then to the sheriff's office, then to Travis Mercer. His lead hand called from the North Flats voice breaking through wind. "Boss cattle are moving wrong." Travis stepped outside Riley's bar, still annoyed, more than worried. "What do you mean wrong? They're bunching against the east fence. Wind's pushing them hard. Open the south gate. We can't see the south gate." Travis's expression changed then. Not fully, but enough. Behind him, the laughter inside the bar had faded. Caleb Price was already grabbing his coat. "I'm going home," he said. Travis snapped, "Don't panic." Caleb looked back at him. "I'm not panicking. I'm late." That line stayed in the room after he left. Ava, meanwhile, had reached the west gate. Ice crusted the chain faster than she expected. She struck it twice with the hammer, then once more harder. The metal gave with a crack that shot pain up her wrist. She gasped, but did not stop. The wind was roaring now, real roaring, the kind that makes buildings sound alive. Snow arrived all at once after that, thick and violent. Not falling down, but flying sideways. The tractor headlights became two glowing circles trapped inside white chaos. Ava checked the gate secured it, then turned back toward the ravine trail. That was when the first bell rang. Not close. Down in the sheltered corridor. Then another. Then several. The herd was shifting, but not breaking. Good. The bells were working. For the first time all day, Ava let herself breathe. Then the radio erupted with Roy Bennett's voice. "Ava, you there?" She lifted the handset. "I'm here. Storm hit faster than expected." "I know." Roy hesitated, and beneath his voice she heard something she had rarely heard from him. "Fear. Mercer's North herd is exposed." Ava closed her eyes. There it was. The sentence she had been dreading all afternoon. How bad and getting worse. Winds driving them toward the old county wash. If they pile there... He did not finish. He didn't have to. Ava knew what happened when cattle piled in a wash during a blizzard. She had seen Daniel cry over it in 1989. For a few seconds, only static filled the tractor cab. Outside, the storm hammered the windshield. Ava looked toward her own ravine, where her herd was protected, because she had endured mockery long enough to move early. Then she looked north toward Travis Mercer's open flats, toward the man who had laughed, toward cattle who had not. And that is when you saw who Ava Williams really was, because revenge would have been easy in that moment. She could have said Travis made his choice. She could have said let him learn. She could have stayed with her own herd, and nobody would have blamed her. But animals do not deserve to suffer for a man's pride. Ava tightened her gloves, shifted the tractor into gear, and spoke into the radio. "Tell whoever can still drive to meet me at Harper's North Road." Roy answered immediately. "Ava, you can't go out in this." Her eyes stayed fixed on the white darkness ahead. "I already am." By nightfall, the prairie no longer looked like Kansas. It looked like the end of the world. Snow moved sideways so violently it erased depth itself. Fence lines vanished. Roads disappeared beneath white drifts forming faster than plows could clear them. Wind screamed across the open land with the sound of something alive and furious. And somewhere inside that chaos, thousands of cattle were trying not to die. Now let me tell you something about blizzards most people never understand. Cold alone is rarely what kills cattle. Confusion does. Panic. Movement without direction. A herd survives winter by staying calm long enough to find shelter. But once fear takes over, animals stop thinking like a herd and start thinking like falling water. They drift, they pile, they push toward fences and ravines and corners until the weakest go down beneath the weight of the rest. Then the cold finishes what fear began. At 6:20 p.m., Travis Mercer finally understood the storm was real. By then it was already too late to prevent disaster. He sat inside his truck, gripping the steering wheel hard enough to whiten his knuckles while sleet exploded across the windshield. Visibility had collapsed to almost nothing. His headlights reflected back at him in spinning white sheets. His lead hand, Rick Dalton, shouted over the radio static. "They're breaking east. Open the south lane," Travis yelled back. "We can't find the damn south lane." Another voice cut in. "Fence is down near County Wash." Then came the sound Travis would remember for the rest of his life. Cattle screaming in panic, not mooing, not bawling, screaming. The sound hit something primitive inside him. Suddenly, the storm was no longer embarrassing, no longer inconvenient. It was bigger than him now, much bigger. Back near Harper's North Road, Sheriff Roy Bennett stood beside his truck while snow whipped around him hard enough to sting exposed skin. 3 other ranchers had arrived after Ava's radio call. Caleb Price, Earl Simmons, and Nate Holloway, whose beard already carried a crust of ice. All of them looked terrified. Then, Ava Williams appeared through the storm driving Daniel's old tractor. The machine emerged slowly from the whiteout, like something ancient refusing to die. The headlights glowed dim through blowing snow. Chains rattled against the tires. The engine growled deep and steady beneath the wind. Ava climbed down carefully, boots sinking into fresh drift. Nobody laughed at her now. Not one person, because fear has a way of stripping mockery out of grown men. Roy stepped toward her immediately. "Mercer's herd split in 2, he shouted. Some broke toward County Wash. Others pushed north fence. Ava nodded once. How long ago? 20 minutes, maybe. That's bad. No drama in her voice, just fact. Caleb swallowed hard. Can we still get them out? Ava looked north into the white storm. The answer was probably no. But she said some of them, and somehow that felt steadier than false hope. Now pause here for a moment. Leadership does not always sound inspiring. Real leadership often sounds calm, while everyone else is panicking. Ava pulled Daniel's laminated map from her coat. The plastic snapped in the wind. "We stay off the flats," she said. "Too exposed. Drift pockets'll bury the trucks." "What about Mercer?" Earl asked. "He follows instructions or he loses more cattle. Simple as that." Then Ava pointed toward the northwest corridor. "There's an old creek route behind the cedar line. Most of you are too young to remember it. That path still holds." Roy stared at her. In this visibility, Ava looked directly at him. "The land doesn't disappear because snow falls on it." That sentence settled over the group heavily, because in that moment they realized something uncomfortable. Ava understood this storm better than any of them, even now, even at 72. Meanwhile, Travis Mercer was losing control completely. His north herd had drifted against the County Wash exactly the way Ava feared. Wind pressure forced animals tighter and tighter together, while sleet froze across their backs in thickening layers. One calf went down first, then another. And once cattle begin falling in a storm, panic spreads through the herd like fire. Travis stumbled through knee-deep snow toward the fence line, screaming at his ranch hands to push the animals south. But the wind stole every command. The cattle no longer heard men. They only heard fear. A black Angus slammed into broken wire and vanished into drifting white darkness. Another animal slipped near the wash edge, dragging 2 more with it into the frozen ditch below. Rick grabbed Travis's arm. "We gotta pull back. No, Travis, listen to me, no. Because arrogance has one final stage before collapse." Denial. Travis still believed effort alone could overpower reality. Then the storm punished him for it. A sudden gust hit so violently it knocked all 3 men sideways. Snow exploded across the flats in blinding waves. Rick disappeared completely for 2 terrifying seconds before crawling back into view. "We can't stay out here," he screamed. And for the first time that night, Travis Mercer looked afraid. Not embarrassed, not irritated, afraid. Back at Harper's Road, Ava led the rescue convoy into the storm. The tractor moved first because the old machine carried weight low and steady against drifting snow. Roy followed behind in his county truck while the others trailed carefully through near-zero visibility. Inside the tractor cab, Ava tracked the land through memory more than sight. Fence post there, dry creek bend here, low drift pocket ahead. The storm erased landmarks, but not experience. If you're still with me, remember this: young men often think knowledge comes from information. Old survivors know knowledge comes from memory paid for dearly. At 7:10 p.m., the group found the first dead cattle. 3 black Angus half buried against a fence drift, frozen already. Caleb looked sick. My God. Ava stopped the tractor only long enough to study the snow patterns. They drifted wrong, she muttered. Then she looked northwest sharply. Mercer's main herd is closer than Roy thinks. "How do you know?" Nate shouted. Ava pointed toward the drift lines, winds carrying scent downhill. None of the men answered, because none of them would have noticed that. Minutes later they heard it. A distant roaring beneath the storm. Cattle movement. Then came the bells. Not Mercer's herd. Ava's. Faint brass ringing drifting through the whiteout from far behind the ravine corridor. The sound steadied her immediately. Her cattle were holding formation. Daniel's system was working, but ahead, chaos. The rescue convoy finally reached the county wash around 7:40. The scene waiting there looked biblical. Hundreds of cattle jammed together in twisting panic beneath blinding snow. Some animals pushed against broken fence wire, while others slipped into the wash below. Steam rose from their bodies into freezing air, and right in the middle of it stood Travis Mercer, alone, trying desperately to turn the herd himself. The storm had stripped everything else away from him, the confidence, the image, the swagger, all gone. He looked like what he truly was underneath. A man hopelessly overmatched by nature. Roy rolled down the truck window. Travis turned toward the lights, stunned. Then he saw who climbed down from the lead tractor, Ava Williams. For a moment he just stared at her through the snow. The same woman he mocked, the same woman he humiliated publicly, the same woman he called outdated, standing there while his operation collapsed around him. Now let me pause here. This is the moment revenge stories usually satisfy people, the moment where the hero finally humiliates the arrogant man back. But real life becomes meaningful in the moments when people choose mercy instead. Ava walked toward Travis through screaming wind. "How many broke south?" she shouted. Travis's face looked pale beneath frozen sleet. I don't know. You know where the wash narrows." He nodded weakly. "Good. We funneled them there." Travis stared at her. "You still came." Ava looked past him toward the terrified herd. "The cattle didn't laugh at me." That sentence hit him harder than the storm. Then Ava turned to the others immediately. "Caleb, take east side with Roy Nate. Stay off the wash edge or you'll lose footing." Everybody moved. Nobody questioned her, because authority earned through survival sounds different than authority borrowed from confidence. For the next hour, Ava Williams led the rescue through conditions most people would never willingly enter. The tractor nearly overturned twice in drift pockets. Earl Simmons lost a glove and nearly 3 fingers to frostbite. Roy's truck slid half into the wash before chains finally caught. But slowly, painfully, the cattle began turning. Not all of them. Some were already gone. But enough. Enough to matter. Enough to save livelihoods. Enough to prove something Red Hollow would never forget. At 8:55 p.m., while the storm still screamed across Kansas like judgment itself, Travis Mercer stood beside Ava, near the narrowed creek pass, watching the surviving herd finally push toward shelter. And for the first time since he was a young man, Travis Mercer understood what real experience looked like. It looked like a 72-year-old widow covered in snow and ice standing steady, while younger men waited for her instructions. The blizzard did not weaken overnight. It grew teeth. By midnight, wind gusts across Red Hollow were pushing nearly 70 miles per hour. Snowdrifts swallowed fence posts entirely. Barn roofs groaned under ice accumulation. Power lines snapped across back roads like broken violin strings. And through all of it, Ava Williams kept moving. Not because she was fearless. Fear had settled deep inside her hours ago. But there is a certain kind of person the prairie creates. Over time, people who continue working long after fear stops mattering. At 12:14 a.m., Ava guided Daniel's old tractor along the Hidden Creek corridor behind the county wash, while the remaining rescue team followed in staggered formation. The tractor lights barely pierced the storm anymore. Snow coated the windshield faster than the wipers could clear it. Ice thickened along Ava's sleeves and collar until she looked sculpted from winter itself. Still, her hands remained steady on the wheel. Roy Bennett sat beside her, now studying the laminated ranch map spread across his knees. "I've lived here 64 years, he admitted quietly over the engine noise. "Didn't even know this trail existed." Ava kept her eyes forward. "Most people stopped using it after the state highway got built. You remembered it all this time." A faint shrug beneath layers of heavy coat. Daniel remembered. "I just listened." Now let me pause here. There's something deeply humbling about realizing survival often depends on the people who spent years being ignored, because wisdom rarely advertises itself. It usually sits quietly in old notebooks while louder people chase attention. Ahead of them, the storm pulsed white and violent across the prairie. Every few minutes, Ava stopped the convoy long enough to listen. Not talk. Listen. The wind changed pitch depending on terrain. Drifts formed differently near ravines. Frozen fence wire hummed when gusts shifted direction. To the others, it sounded like noise. To Ava, it was information. At 12:47 a.m., they found another trapped group of cattle. Not Mercer's this time. Caleb Price spotted them first. Dark bodies clustered tightly against a cedar break where snow had drifted chest-high around the animals. "Over there," he shouted. The group moved immediately. 3 calves were already down. One had frozen completely. Caleb knelt beside the animal anyway, gloves trembling as he tried brushing snow from its face. "It's gone," Roy said softly. Caleb swallowed hard, but nodded. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Ava pointed toward the surviving cattle. "Get the living ones moving." That sentence hurt Caleb. Ava saw it. But storms do not pause for grief. The living still needed saving. Together, they broke drift paths around the trapped herd, while Ava rang one of Daniel's brass cattle bells through the screaming wind. The sound carried strangely across the storm, soft but steady. And slowly, unbelievably, the cattle began turning toward it. Travis Mercer stared at the scene from horseback nearby, exhausted and half-frozen. "You trained them to follow bells?" he asked. Daniel did. "That actually works enough." The answer unsettled him, because nothing about Ava's system looked modern. No expensive tracking software, no drones, no digital monitoring. Just memory, terrain, animal behavior, preparation. Things Travis had dismissed as outdated. Now those outdated things were saving cattle while his $1 million operation collapsed in the snow. If you're still with me, notice something important. The storm did not create Travis Mercer's weakness. It revealed it. There's a difference. Around 1:30 a.m., the convoy reached the old Miller Ridge crossing. That was where the real danger began. The ridge sat exposed above open prairie with almost no natural wind protection. Under normal conditions, it was manageable. Tonight, it looked like the surface of another planet. Snow blasted sideways so violently the world disappeared beyond 20 feet. Drifts shifted constantly beneath the vehicles. One wrong angle could bury the tractor or flip a truck directly into the ravine below. Roy looked at Ava carefully. "We should wait it out. No time?" "Ava." If the south herd breaks north, they'll drift straight into open flats. Roy cursed softly under his breath, because he knew she was right. Ava climbed down from the tractor, slowly, knees stiff from cold and hours of work. She tied another orange marker to a buried fence post, then another farther ahead, step by step, marker by marker, building a path through blindness. Travis watched her in disbelief. "You're going out there on foot." Ava didn't stop moving. "I already know where the ridge is." "That's insane." Finally, she turned toward him. "No," she said calmly. "Waiting for daylight is insane." That shut him up. Now let me tell you something painful about pride. It becomes unbearable once reality starts proving another person right. Travis Mercer had spent years building an identity around being the smartest rancher in the county. Younger men admired him. Local papers interviewed him. Bankers trusted him. And now he was following an elderly widow through a blizzard because she understood the land better than he ever had. That realization hollowed something inside him. At 2:05 a.m., disaster nearly struck again. Nate Holloway's truck slid sideways, crossing the ridge. One tire dropped over the embankment edge, and the whole vehicle lurched violently toward the ravine below. Nate Caleb screamed. For one terrible second, everyone froze. The truck tilted farther. Wind roared. Snow buried visibility completely. Then Ava moved. Not fast. Precise. She grabbed a tow chain from the tractor and shouted instructions through the storm. "Roy, anchor west side, Caleb, keep tension off the rear axle." Nobody hesitated. Nobody argued. Even Travis obeyed instantly. Because by then Ava's authority felt absolute. The rescue took nearly 20 brutal minutes. Fingers numbed, chains iced over. Twice the truck nearly slipped free again. But eventually the tires caught. The vehicle slammed back onto solid ground. Nate climbed out, shaking hard. "Thought I was dead." Ava only nodded once. "Not tonight. Sit with that for a moment." That's the thing about true competence. It calms panic without needing applause. By 3:00 a.m., exhaustion began breaking people down. Caleb's hands bled through cracked gloves. Roy's left shoulder stiffened from fighting steering wheels against drifting wind. Travis looked physically ill from cold and guilt combined. But Ava kept going. Somehow, she checked every trapped herd report coming through Roy's radio, mapped routes mentally, directed trucks toward shelter corridors, identified safe drift lines from memory alone. At one point, Caleb finally asked the question everybody had been silently thinking. "How are you still standing?" Ava adjusted her scarf against the cold. "Because the storm doesn't care how tired I am. No self-pity. No heroics. Just truth." Near dawn, the convoy finally reached the sheltered ravine system surrounding the Williams Ranch. And for the first time all night, the storm lost. Not entirely, but enough. The difference hit them immediately. Wind weakened beneath the cottonwoods. Snow drifted lower across the protected slopes. Hay stations remained accessible exactly where Ava placed them days earlier, and most importantly, the cattle were alive. Hundreds of them, sheltered among the ravines, cedar lines, and protected feed corridors Daniel designed decades before. The brass bells rang softly through the darkness while the herd fed calmly, despite the storm raging above. Caleb removed his gloves, slowly staring in disbelief. My God. Even Roy looked emotional. Travis said nothing at all. He simply stood there, watching Ava's cattle survive inside a system he once mocked publicly. And for the first time in his adult life, Travis Mercer understood something modern success had hidden from him. Experience is not old information. It is paid-for information, usually paid for in pain. Ava walked quietly through the sheltered herd, checking calves, examining drift buildup, adjusting hay placement where needed. Not celebrating, working. Because survival on the prairie is never permanent. You keep earning it 1 hour at a time. Then suddenly one young calf stumbled sideways near the creek bank. Without hesitation, Ava crossed through waist-deep snow toward it. Roy shouted, "Ava, leave it!" She ignored him. The calf's legs had locked from cold. Ice coated its face and nostrils. Ava knelt painfully beside the animal, brushing snow away with bare fingers, despite the freezing wind. Travis stared at her. "You'll freeze doing that." Ava looked up briefly. Animals don't care who mocked you yesterday. There it was again. That quiet mercy. That refusal to become cruel even after humiliation. And somehow that hurt Travis more than anger would have. Together, Ava and Caleb finally lifted the calf onto a feed sled and dragged it toward the lower shelter line, where warmth from clustered cattle might still save it. The eastern sky had just begun turning faint gray. Not sunlight yet, just the promise of it, and as dawn slowly approached through the storm, the people of Red Hollow began understanding something they would talk about for the rest of their lives. The blizzard had not crowned the richest rancher, or the youngest, or the loudest. It had followed the woman who listened first. By Saturday morning, the storm had finally exhausted itself. Not ended peacefully. Exhausted. Like some enormous animal that had spent 2 days clawing at the prairie until even destruction grew tired. The wind weakened first. Then the snow eased into lighter sheets, drifting lazily across buried fence lines and frozen roads. Pale winter sunlight pushed weakly through the clouds, illuminating what the blizzard had left behind. And Red Hollow, Kansas woke into silence. Not ordinary silence. Aftermath silence. The kind that settles over people after disaster, forces them to measure what remains. Now let me tell you something about mornings after storms. They reveal truth more honestly than almost anything else in life. Because damage cannot be argued with. Numbers become real. Pride becomes expensive. And the land keeps perfect records of every bad decision. At dawn, ranchers across the county began checking their herds. The results were brutal. Fence collapses, frozen calves, buried feed stations, drifted cattle piled against creek beds and north-facing barriers, entire grazing sections unreachable beneath massive snowbanks. Some operations lost dozens of head, others lost hundreds. And Travis Mercer lost enough cattle to change his life. No one knew the exact number yet. Not fully. But everybody understood the scale the moment they saw the Mercer North Flats. Bodies half buried in snow. Broken wire scattered across drifts. Equipment stranded where visibility vanished too quickly to escape. A week earlier, those same pastures had appeared modern and unstoppable. Now they looked fragile. Sit with that for a moment. Because arrogance always appears strongest right before reality introduces itself. Meanwhile, the Williams Ranch stood almost untouched. Not untouched by weather. Nothing survives a prairie blizzard untouched, but protected. The ravine corridors held. The cedar breaks slowed the drifting exactly as Daniel's notes predicted. Emergency hay placement stayed accessible. Water points remained open beneath insulated covers Ava installed days before the storm. Most importantly, the cattle lived, not all of them. A few calves had still been lost during the coldest hours. One older cow never recovered from stress after the rescue effort. But compared to the devastation surrounding Red Hollow, the Williams Ranch looked miraculous. By mid-morning, word had spread through the county. People drove slowly past Ava's property just to stare at the sheltered herds, moving calmly through the ravines. Some ranchers stopped near the roadside in silence, studying the cedar windbreaks and low sheltered corridors they once mocked openly. Suddenly, those old-fashioned systems looked very intelligent. Funny how fast respect changes direction after survival gets involved. Ava herself did not participate in any of that conversation. She was too busy working. At 72 years old, after nearly 40 straight hours, without real sleep, she still walked the ranch checking calves, reinforcing weakened fencing, and making notes inside Daniel's weather journal. The notebook rested against the hood of the old tractor, while snow drifted softly around her boots. Wind shift confirmed. Ravine held. Bell system effective under panic movement. Her handwriting looked shakier than usual. Not from fear anymore. Exhaustion, deep exhaustion. Roy Bennett found her near the lower creek crossing around noon. "You should be inside resting," he said. Ava continued tightening a gate chain. "So should you." Roy smiled faintly. "That's fair?" For a while they worked in silence together. Then Roy finally said what had been sitting heavily on his mind all morning. "You saved a lot of people out here." Ava shook her head. "We saved cattle." Roy leaned against the fence post. "You know what I mean." Yes, she did. Because out here, cattle were not just animals. They were mortgages, feed bills, college funds, retirement plans, family survival. Losing a herd could destroy generations of work. Ava looked across the ravine, where the brass bells moved softly among the surviving cattle. "I was just listening to Daniel," she said quietly. "Now let me pause here. Grief changes shape over time. At first it feels like absence. Then, eventually, if you survive long enough, it becomes companionship of another kind. Daniel Williams was gone. But not really. Not from this ranch. Not from the fences he built. Not from the gates he placed. Not from the notebooks filled with warnings nobody respected until now. Legacy is a strange thing. Sometimes the dead continue protecting people through the habits they leave behind. Around 2 that afternoon, Travis Mercer finally drove onto the Williams property. Alone. No ranch hands, no expensive truck convoy, no confidence. Just Travis in a mud-covered pickup with exhausted eyes and a face that looked 10 years older than it had 2 days earlier. Ava saw him park near the barn, but kept stacking feed bags without acknowledging him immediately. Travis walked slowly toward her through crusted snow. For a moment he looked like he might speak. Instead, he simply stared across the ravine system, at the sheltered cattle, at the windbreaks, at the paths he once called outdated. Then he laughed once under his breath. Not because anything was funny, because humiliation sometimes leaves a person too empty for anger. "I lost 137 head, he said finally. Ava stopped working. That number hung heavily between them. 137. Millions of pounds of feed, years of breeding investment, loan payments, expansion contracts, gone. The prairie had handed Travis Mercer a bill for his arrogance, and it had come due overnight. "I'm sorry," Ava said quietly. Travis looked at her sharply. That almost broke him more than the losses, because she meant it. No satisfaction in her voice, no revenge, no cruelty, just honest sorrow. Now listen carefully. Mercy embarrasses proud people more deeply than revenge ever could. Travis looked away toward the ravine. "I thought you were scared." Ava nodded once. "I was. Then why'd you move early?" "Because fear's useful if you listen to it before panic starts." The simplicity of that answer crushed whatever excuses Travis still carried. He rubbed both hands across his face slowly. "I thought experience was something money could replace." Ava did not answer immediately. Snow drifted lightly through the cedar breaks around them. Finally, she said, "Most people think wisdom means knowing more." Travis looked at her. But mostly, Ava continued, it means surviving long enough to stop ignoring what hurts. That sentence settled deep, because suddenly Travis understood what Daniel's systems really were. Not superstition, not fear, scar tissue. Built after pain. Caleb Price arrived an hour later carrying feed supplements in the back of his truck. Unlike Travis, Caleb looked humbled rather than broken. "You mind if I ask you something?" he said carefully. Ava nodded. "How'd you know the ravine would hold?" Ava smiled faintly. "It didn't start with me." She led Caleb into the Old West storage shed, where Daniel's notebooks remained stacked beside lanterns and rolled pasture maps. Caleb stared around the room quietly. This was all Daniel's, most of it. Ava picked up one notebook and handed it to him. Inside were decades of handwritten observations. Storm tracks, drift angles, cattle reactions, water freeze times, wind behavior across specific elevations. Caleb flipped pages slowly, almost reverently. My God. Daniel believed ranching was mostly remembering, Ava said softly. That line stayed with Caleb. Years later, he would repeat it to his own children. Outside the shed, Travis stood alone near the tractor for a long time. The old machine looked even rougher in daylight. Rust along the wheel wells, faded paint, chains hanging heavy against the tires, He remembered mocking it publicly. Museum equipment. Now that tractor had pulled rescue teams through conditions his modern equipment could barely survive. Funny how storms rearrange a man's understanding of value. As evening approached, more ranchers quietly stopped by the Williams property. Not to laugh, to learn. Some asked about the ravine systems, others wanted to see the windbreak layouts. A few simply stood silently watching the cattle bells move through the protected herd. No one called Ava crazy anymore. No one suggested she was too old to ranch alone, because the blizzard had destroyed that illusion completely. Age had not weakened Ava Williams. Age had sharpened her. Every hard winter, every loss, every notebook entry, every lonely year after Daniel died, all of it had become preparation. At sunset, Ava finally stood alone beside the north fence line. The prairie looked different now, not because the land had changed, because the people had. Far off in the distance, damaged ranch lights flickered weakly beneath melting snowdrifts. Recovery would take months. Some operations might never fully recover at all. But the Williams Ranch still stood, and somewhere deep inside the cold evening wind, Ava could almost hear Daniel laughing softly the way he used to after surviving difficult winters. Not triumphant laughter, relieved laughter. The kind shared by people who respected nature enough to prepare before everyone else believed them. A brass cattle bell rang gently somewhere down in the ravine. Ava closed her eyes briefly. Then she whispered into the fading light, "We held it together, Daniel." And for the first time since the storm began, she finally allowed herself to cry. Spring arrived slowly across Red Hollow, not dramatically. The prairie never healed dramatically. Snow softened into mud. Frozen fence posts loosened from the earth. Brown grass pushed stubbornly through thawing ground. Cattle wandered farther from winter shelter with each warming sunrise. And everywhere you looked across the county, the blizzard had left scars behind. Collapsed barns still waited for repairs. Empty sections of pasture reminded ranchers where herds once stood. Auction prices shifted uneasily as operations tried rebuilding from losses some families would spend years paying off. But one thing had changed more than the land. The people had changed. Now let me tell you something about survival. Communities do not always learn from success, but they almost always learn from humiliation. Especially public humiliation. Nobody in Red Hollow laughed when Ava Williams drove into town anymore. At Harper Feed and Supply, conversations paused differently now when she entered. Men who once mocked her weather notebooks quietly asked questions about windbreak placement. Younger ranchers stopped pretending experience was outdated. Even Miller's Diner had changed. The same booth where people once joked about Ava's ghost blizzard now hosted serious conversations about cattle shelter systems and emergency feed corridors. Funny how quickly wisdom becomes respectable after it saves enough money. But Ava herself did not change much at all. That was perhaps the strangest part. She still woke before dawn, still checked wind direction before coffee, still wrote inside Daniel's notebooks every morning beside the kitchen stove. Storm patterns, freeze depth, bird movement. Some habits survive because they work. Others survive because love built them. One April afternoon, Caleb Price arrived at the ranch, carrying lumber in the back of his truck. "You starting repairs?" Ava asked. Caleb nodded. "Actually, I wanted to ask something first." He hesitated awkwardly, then finally said it. "Would you teach me the ravine system?" Ava studied him quietly, not because she doubted him, because the question mattered. Caleb was the first younger rancher humble enough to ask for knowledge instead of pretending he already possessed it. That changed everything. Over the next few weeks, others started arriving too. Nate Holloway came first, then Earl Simmons, then ranchers from neighboring counties who had heard about the Williams storm corridors through livestock auctions and county meetings. Soon, Ava found herself doing something she never expected this late in life teaching. Not formally. Nothing polished. She walked people through pasture routes in old work boots while pointing at cedar lines and drainage cuts. This corridor blocks crosswind. Snow stacks here first. Cattle panic downhill if visibility collapses. Never place feed where drifting can trap movement. Simple lessons, but hard-earned ones. And because Ava taught them without ego, people listened more carefully. If you're still with me, remember this. True wisdom rarely tries to impress anyone. It simply tries to prevent suffering. By early summer, Caleb suggested something bigger. You should make this official, he told her. Ava frowned. Make what official? The training. She almost laughed. Nobody's coming out here for classes. Caleb looked around the ranch. Half a dozen pickup trucks already lined the pasture road. Yes, they are. That realization startled her, because for years Ava Williams had believed Red Hollow saw her as something outdated, a leftover from another era, an old widow clinging stubbornly to old methods. Now those same methods were spreading across the county. 1 month later, the Williams Winter Preparedness Workshop officially began. Now don't imagine some fancy institution. No polished conference rooms, no sponsorship banners, no expensive presentations. Just ranchers gathered inside Daniel's old machine shed with folding chairs, coffee thermoses, handwritten maps, and the sound of cattle bells drifting softly outside. Ava taught storm preparation using the same notebooks people once mocked. Daniel's notebooks. Every page carried scars of old winters. 1989 whiteout patterns, drift formation sketches, emergency shelter diagrams, animal behavior observations. The younger ranchers treated those notebooks almost reverently now, because pain gives credibility to information in a way theories never can. One afternoon during the second workshop session, Caleb asked Ava something in front of everyone. What was the biggest thing Daniel ever taught you? The room quieted immediately. Ava stood beside the old chalkboard for a moment, thinking carefully. Then she answered. He taught me the land is always talking. Nobody moved. He said most people only notice nature once it starts hurting them, but the prairie whispers first. Wind changes, birds lower, cattle shift. Silence feels wrong. The warning is almost always there. She paused. Problem is, pride makes people deaf. You could have heard a pin drop inside that shed, because everyone in that room knew exactly who that lesson included, especially Travis Mercer. Yes, even Travis came. Not at first. For weeks after the storm, Travis avoided public gatherings almost entirely. The financial losses hit hard enough that he sold equipment just to stabilize loan payments. Insurance covered some damage, but not enough. More painful than the money, though, was the memory. Standing helpless in that storm while Ava Williams led the rescue. Watching his confidence collapse in real time. Humility is a brutal teacher when learned late. Then, one July evening, Travis finally walked into the workshop shed. Conversation stopped instantly. Ava looked up from the map table. Travis removed his cap slowly. I figured I should probably learn something. Nobody smiled. Nobody mocked him. Because suffering had stripped the arrogance from him so completely that cruelty would have felt unnecessary. Ava simply nodded toward an empty chair. Sit down. And he did. Now let me pause here. That may have been the most important moment in the entire story. Not the storm, not the rescue, not the humiliation. This. A proud man deciding learning mattered more than protecting his ego. That is rare. Rarer than blizzards. Over time, Travis became one of the workshop's strongest supporters. He funded additional shelter belt planting programs across northern Kansas and helped younger ranchers redesign exposed winter grazing systems. But he never pretended the ideas belonged to him. That mattered too. At the annual county agricultural meeting the following winter, the community gathered inside the high school gymnasium just outside Red Hollow. Nearly every ranching family attended. Toward the end of the evening, Sheriff Roy Bennett stepped to the microphone. There's someone this county owes thanks to, he said. Ava immediately looked uncomfortable. Roy ignored that. 1 year ago, a lot of us thought experience had expired, thought old knowledge didn't matter anymore. Then the storm showed us exactly how wrong we were. People began applauding softly, then harder. Then the entire room stood. Ava Williams sat frozen in her chair while ranchers' families and neighbors rose around her. Not because she was old, because she had been right. Travis Mercer stepped forward next. The gym quieted again. He looked directly at Ava. "I mocked you publicly," he said plainly, "and when everything fell apart, you still came to help." His voice tightened slightly. "I thought modern ranching meant controlling nature, but you and Daniel understood something I didn't." He paused. "You don't control the prairie. You survive it by respecting it." Silence filled the room afterward. Heavy silence. Honest silence. Ava finally stood slowly from her chair, and in typical Ava Williams fashion after all of it, after the storm, after the rescue, after the humiliation reversed itself, she simply said, "Well, better you learned it now than later." The room erupted into laughter and applause. Warm laughter this time. Not cruel. Healing. Late that evening, Ava returned home alone. The prairie stretched gold beneath the setting Kansas sun. Wind moved gently through the cedar corridors Daniel planted decades ago. Down in the ravines, cattle grazed peacefully, while brass bells rang softly across the land. Ava stopped beside the north pasture gate, the same gate she chained shut before the storm, the same gate everyone laughed at. She rested one hand against the weathered wood and looked across the ranch quietly. Then she finally understood something Daniel had spent his whole life trying to teach without ever saying directly. Strength was never the point. Not really. Listening was. The storm had not revealed who was strongest. It revealed who had listened when the land whispered first. And somewhere beyond the fading light, the prairie wind moved softly through the cottonwoods like an old voice finally at peace.